The New York dawn was spreading its pastel hues over the Manhattan buildings when James Miller pushed open the door of the Artist's Cafe. The soft chime of the bell announced his entrance, but only the young woman who was cleaning tables with precise economical movements briefly looked up. The establishment was almost empty at this early hour, bathed in a soft light that softened the contours of the worn wooden furniture. The aroma of freshly baked pastries mingled with that of freshly ground coffee, creating an olfactory symphony so typically New Yorker. James settled at a table in the farthest corner, placing his Italian leather briefcase on the adjacent chair. He wore a tailored three-piece navy suit, a discreet but expensive watch on his wrist, and that impenetrable air of those accustomed to having the world bend to their will. His graying temples and the expression lines around his eyes testified to his 45 years, but it was especially his gaze, calculating and distant, that revealed the weight of years spent transforming failing companies into lucrative empires. In the inside pocket of his jacket rested a check whose amount would have seemed obscene to most people. To him, it was just another strategic investment. The waitress finally approached, notepad in hand. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her simple uniform was impeccably clean despite some visible mending at the elbows. Her brown hair was tied in a practical ponytail, and her face, though marked by the fatigue of a night's work, radiated a natural beauty that minimal makeup only enhanced. "Good morning, sir. What can I get you today?" she asked in a soft but assured voice. James observed her for a moment, evaluating every detail as he did with everything. He noticed her hands that worked hard, and the way she stood straight despite her obvious exhaustion. "An espresso and a croissant," he replied curtly. "Right away, sir." As she walked away, he pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through his emails. Tonight's charity gala was crucial. Conservative investors would be present, those who valued the image of a stable, established man with a balanced personal life. Arriving alone would be a strategic error he couldn't afford, not with the acquisition of the Wilson Group at stake. His secretary had failed to arrange a suitable companion on such short notice, and the tabloids were beginning to speculate about his solitary life. The waitress returned with his order, gently placing the cup of steaming espresso and the plate containing the golden croissant. She was about to leave when James uttered the words that would change everything. "Miss, I have a proposal for you." She turned around, surprised, with slight wariness in her gaze. "A proposal? My name is James Miller. I need a companion for an event tonight, a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. I'm offering you $10,000 for a few hours of your time." The cup she was holding wobbled dangerously, the dark liquid threatening to spill over. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with growing indignation. "Sir, I'm not that kind of—" "You'll just need to wear a nice dress, smile at the right people, and pretend to be my girlfriend." "Nothing more," he interrupted, placing a business card on the table. "Think about it. My driver can pick you up at 7. He drank his espresso in one gulp, left an excessive tip, and exited the cafe as calmly as he had entered, leaving behind a Sarah Johnson oscillating between outrage and unexpected vertigo at the amount proposed, a sum that would precisely cover the care her grandmother desperately needed. The late afternoon sun bathed the modest Brooklyn apartment in a golden light that warmed the faded walls. Sarah had been contemplating the business card for hours, turning it between her fingers as if she might discover a hidden message. On the kitchen table were bills with threatening red headers and, more importantly, the doctor's prescription for a treatment that health insurance only partially covered. In the neighboring room, her grandmother Martha coughed, a constant reminder of the urgency of the situation. This woman had given her everything, had raised her alone when her parents had abandoned her at the age of 7 to live their lives abroad. Now it was her turn to give. Sarah stood up and approached the chipped mirror hanging in the entryway. Her reflection showed a young woman exhausted by her 3 jobs: waitress at night, homemaid in the afternoon, and student during the rare free hours that remained. She had to interrupt her business studies at Columbia University 2 years earlier when her grandmother's health deteriorated. It was only a postponement, she told herself each morning as she opened her textbooks for a few precious minutes of study. $10,000, she murmured, testing the sound of these words in the silence of the apartment. For a few hours, this man's proposal was indecent. But was it more indecent than letting her grandmother suffer? Was it more indecent than the 3 reminders from the hospital threatening to stop palliative care? Her phone vibrated. It was Amy, her best friend and colleague at the cafe. "So are you going to accept the mysterious man's offer?" Amy asked without preamble as soon as Sarah answered. "How do you know about it?" "Mike overheard everything. It's not every day a guy in a luxury suit offers $10,000 to a waitress." "Who is he anyway?" Sarah looked at the business card again. "James Miller, CEO of Miller Acquisitions." A silence settled on the other end of the line, followed by an admiring whistle. "Sarah, do you know who that is?" "The man who buys struggling companies to turn them into gold mines. He's on the cover of the latest Forbes." "I don't read Forbes," Sarah replied sharply. "You should. He's worth hundreds of millions. They call him the Iceman in the business world. Never married, no known children. A mysterious background before his appearance in the financial world 20 years ago." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "That doesn't exactly reassure me." "Listen, it's just a charity dinner. Hundreds of people, cameras, New York high society. It's probably the safest place to be with him. And $10,000, Sarah. Think of your grandmother." Amy's words were still echoing in her head when, 3 hours later, she found herself in the Upper East Side luxury boutique, where James Miller had arranged for her to choose an outfit. The saleswoman, with a commercial smile but a slightly condescending look, guided her among dresses, whose price would have covered her annual rent. "Mr. Miller left specific instructions regarding the style," the saleswoman explained, presenting a selection of dresses. "Elegant but not ostentatious. He mentioned that you would prefer something classic." How could he know what she would prefer? Sarah felt a twinge of irritation at this presumption. Yet when she put on the midnight blue dress with its discreet neckline and impeccable cut, something in her transformed. The flowing fabric embraced her form with a delicacy that surprised her. For the first time in years, she saw herself not as the exhausted young woman who worked tirelessly, but as the one she could have been in another life, a life where choices weren't dictated by survival. At 7 o'clock sharp, a black sedan stopped in front of her building. The driver, a middle-aged man with an impassive face, opened the door for her with a deference that made her uncomfortable. "Good evening, Miss Johnson. Mr. Miller will meet you directly at the plaza. He asked me to give you this." He handed her a velvet box containing a discreet pearl necklace that, though simple, was obviously authentic and expensive. "I can't accept this," said Sarah, pushing the box back. "Mr. Miller insists. It's a loan for the evening only." Just like the dress. The mention of this loan brutally brought Sarah back to reality. All of this was just a role-playing game, a commercial arrangement. She was just an accessory for the evening, like this necklace she was being asked to wear. This thought, rather than offending her, paradoxically reassured her. The boundaries were clear, the expectations defined. As she got into the car, Sarah couldn't help thinking about what had really pushed her to accept. Was it only for the money? Or was there also that unmentionable curiosity to see, if only for an evening, the other side of the mirror, that hermetic world of the privileged whose coffees she served each morning? The lights of the Plaza Hotel reflected on the dark waters of the Central Park pond, creating a sparkling tableau that Sarah contemplated for a moment from the sidewalk. The elegant building housed the cream of New York and international finance that evening. Luxury cars paraded by, dropping off guests in sumptuous attire with calibrated smiles. James was waiting for her at the entrance, impeccable in his black tuxedo. A slight surprise crossed his gaze when he saw her get out of the car, as if he was rediscovering the person he had hired. It wasn't Sarah's physical appearance that struck him, though she was undeniably elegant in her midnight blue dress, but the dignity with which she wore this borrowed outfit, as if elegance was an inner quality that clothes merely highlighted. "Miss Johnson, you look ravishing," he said, offering her his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," she responded simply, accepting his arm with polite reserve. "James," he corrected in a low voice as they climbed the steps. "Tonight you're Sarah, my girlfriend of 6 months. We met at a modern art exhibition at the MoMA. I've never set foot in the MoMA. It doesn't matter. The essential thing is that we appear compatible. I understand the concept of pretending, Mr. James." He cast a sidelong glance at her, surprised by the slight sarcastic tone he detected in her voice. This woman wasn't exactly what he had anticipated, not the intimidated and grateful waitress he had imagined. Inside, the hall resonated with animated conversations and the discreet tinkling of champagne flutes. Sarah observed everything with a silent attention that didn't escape James. She wasn't trying to impress. She was absorbing the places, the people, the invisible dynamics that governed this universe. He guided her among the groups, introducing his girlfriend with an ease that betrayed his habit of these social events. "Sarah, let me introduce you to William Wilson, the president of the group we were recently discussing," James announced as they approached a corpulent man with a pronounced southern accent. "Enchanted, miss," said Wilson, kissing Sarah's hand with an old-fashioned gallantry. "James is certainly full of surprises. We've been negotiating for 3 months, and he never mentioned the existence of such a charming companion." "James likes to compartmentalize his life," Sarah replied with a polite smile. "Work on one side, personal on the other." "A man of principles," exclaimed Wilson. "Rare these days. You're from New York, Miss Johnson, Sarah Johnson, and no, my family originally comes from Virginia. My grandmother worked as a cook in several vineyard estates near Charlottesville before settling in New York." Wilson's face lit up instantly. "Charlottesville. I was born there. My father owned a small estate outside town. What was the name of the estate where your grandmother worked?" "Cedar Grove," Sarah replied, surprised by this coincidence. "But I know it perfectly well," exclaimed Wilson. "Old Reynolds was the owner at the time, a formidable man, but with an impossible temper. Your grandmother must have had the patience of an angel." Sarah's face softened at the evocation of these memories. "She always said that Mr. Reynolds yelled a lot, but that his heart was as generous as his wines. She took me harvesting there when I was 12. I still remember the smell of grapes in the sun, and the songs the harvesters sang." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah and Wilson exchanged memories of the region, evoking village festivals, wine-making traditions, and the colorful characters that populated that corner of Virginia. James observed this exchange with a mixture of surprise and irritation. This woman he had chosen almost at random had just accomplished in a few minutes what he had been trying to do for months: establish an authentic connection with the man on whom the most important acquisition of the year depended. Later in the evening, as they were momentarily alone near the buffet, James couldn't help but question her. "How did you do that?" "Do what?" asked Sarah, taking a small bite of a canapé. "With Wilson. He's eating out of your hand now." Sarah looked at him with an indecipherable expression. "I didn't do anything. I simply shared authentic memories. That's what normal people do, you know. They talk about things that matter to them." James remained silent for a moment, absorbing this observation as an implicit criticism. "In any case, it was useful," he finally said. "Wilson is crucial for the acquisition I'm negotiating." "Glad to have been useful," Sarah replied, a touch of irony in her voice. "That's why you hired me, isn't it?" Before he could answer, an elegant woman in her 50s approached, her sharp gaze passing from James to Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "James, what a pleasure to see you finally accompanied," she said sweetly, "and by such a charming young woman." "I'm Elizabeth Davis, an old friend of dear James." "Sarah Johnson," Sarah replied, shaking the extended hand. "Pleased to meet you." "Sarah and I met 6 months ago," James interjected, deliberately placing a hand on the small of Sarah's back. This unexpected contact made her slightly flinch, but she maintained her smile, aware of the role she had to play. "At an exhibition," she completed. "James was fascinated by a work that I found particularly cold." Elizabeth let out a crystalline laugh. "Oh, that's so like him. James has always had this weakness for cold and calculated things. In art as in life, isn't that right, my dear?" The slight discomfort that settled was interrupted by the announcement of dinner. As they headed toward the tables, Sarah felt James's gaze weighing on her, a silent question she chose to ignore. The evening was still long, and she was beginning to understand that the role she had agreed to play was much more complex than it appeared. Dinner was taking place in a hushed atmosphere, punctuated by the discreet clink of silverware on fine china and the murmur of conversations. Sarah, seated between James and a renowned economist, observed with fascination the silent choreography of the servers, those invisibles of whom she was usually a part, now seen from the other side of the mirror. James, for his part, kept observing her from the corner of his eye. Something troubled him about this young woman. It wasn't just the surprising ease with which she adapted to this environment that was foreign to her. It was that quiet authenticity, that contrasted with the artificial smiles and calculated laughter surrounding her. In this ocean of pretense, she seemed to be the only person truly present. "So, Sarah, what do you do for a living?" suddenly asked the economist's wife, breaking the thread of his thoughts. James felt a sudden tension invade him. They hadn't prepared for this predictable question. "I work in the restaurant business," Sarah replied without hesitation, "and I study business part-time." A polite silence settled, this response evidently not matching the lady's expectations. "Restaurant business? How interesting," she finally commented. "And how did you meet James? He's so caught up in his affairs." "At an exhibition, as we mentioned," James intervened, deliberately placing his hand on Sarah's. What Sarah doesn't specify is that she has a remarkable talent for analyzing business models. Her perspective on the restaurant market has opened my eyes. Sarah gave him a surprised look that he ignored, continuing his improvisation. "She sees aspects that we businessmen locked in our ivory towers often miss. It's refreshing." "You exaggerate, James," she said softly. "I just share my daily observations. When you serve coffee at 6 in the morning, you see people without their usual masks." Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, a tacit recognition that she was alluding to their first meeting, to his abrupt proposal, to that moment when he too had been without a mask. The rest of the dinner proceeded without major incident, but something had changed in the dynamic between them. When the time came for the silent auction for the charity foundation organizing the event, James excused himself from his table mates and led Sarah to the terrace overlooking Central Park. The night air was cool but pleasant. The lights of New York reflected on the dark water, creating a moving tableau of golden points. The hubbub of the room faded here, replaced by the soothing rustle of leaves in the light breeze. "You're doing remarkably well," said James, leaning against the balustrade. "I observe and adapt," Sarah replied simply. "That's what people who serve others do. They become what's needed." James studied her in the semi-darkness. The soft light filtering from inside highlighted the delicate line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, that expression both gentle and determined that seemed to be her signature. "Why did you accept my proposal?" he suddenly asked. "So you don't seem the type who sells herself," she completed with a touch of defiance in her voice. "That's not what I was going to say." "But it's what you were thinking, isn't it? People like you always believe that everything can be bought. Companies, loyalties, and people." James felt an unexpected anger rise in him, not against her, but against this truth she stated so simply. "People like me?" he repeated, with a sudden coldness in his voice. "You think you know me after a few hours?" "I know your type," she replied, holding his gaze. "Men who build empires to fill a void they don't even dare to name, who collect successes like others collect stamps, never being satisfied." "And you're different, perhaps," he retorted. "You who accept to play this role for money, we're all for sale, Miss Johnson. The only difference is the price." As soon as these words left his mouth, he regretted them. Sarah's face closed, and something went out in her gaze. "My price, as you call it, will pay for my grandmother's medical treatment," she said softly. "She has terminal cancer. The hospital is threatening to stop her palliative care if we don't settle the overdue bills. So yes, I have a price, and it's called love." The silence that followed was deafening. James felt an unknown emotion tighten his throat, a mixture of shame and something he couldn't identify. I'm sorry," he finally said, these words so foreign to him coming out awkwardly. "I can help you more if—" "No," she cut in firmly. "I accepted this arrangement because it has clear limits. $10,000 for one evening. No complications, no future obligations, no moral debt." A discreet throat clearing interrupted them. James's driver stood a few steps away. "Excuse me, Mr. Miller. Mr. Wilson is looking for you to finalize your earlier conversation." James nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Stay here if you'd like. Take a moment. I'll join you later." As he walked away, Sarah remained alone facing the park, contemplating the constant flow of the breeze through the trees that reflected the city lights. She wondered what had pushed her to confide like this in a man she barely knew, why she had felt the need to justify her decision, to show him she wasn't what he thought. And more troubling still, why did James Miller's opinion matter to her? A week had passed since the gala. Sarah had resumed her routine. the cafe early in the morning, caring for her grandmother in the afternoon, the few hours of study snatched between two responsibilities. The $10,000 had disappeared almost instantly, swallowed up by medical bills and overdue rent. But for the first time in months, she breathed a little easier, momentarily freed from the financial stranglehold that was suffocating her. She didn't expect to see James Miller again. Their arrangement had been clear and limited in time. The car had taken her home at the end of the evening. He had handed her an envelope containing the promised sum, and they had parted with the distant politeness of two strangers whose paths had briefly crossed. Yet that morning, as Sarah was wiping down tables before the cafe opened, the bell on the door chimed and James appeared, as impeccable in his grey suit as at their first meeting. There was, however, a slight difference, an almost imperceptible hesitation in his usually assured gait. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, sitting at the same table as last time. "Mr. Miller," she replied, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you again." "James," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, haven't we?" She raised an eyebrow, a gesture that betrayed her skepticism. "What can I get you?" she asked, opting for a professionalism that clearly established the boundaries of their interaction. "An espresso, please, and a moment of your time." Sarah prepared the order in silence, aware of his gaze following her across the room. When she returned with the espresso, James surprised her by asking, "What time do you finish today?" "Why do you ask?" she replied, suddenly on her guard. "I have a proposal for you," he said simply. "Again?" she said with a small, joyless laugh. "The last one turned out to be complex." James nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of this observation. "This one is different, professional. The acquisition of the Wilson Group was finalized yesterday, largely thanks to our conversation with William during the gala. He specifically mentioned my girlfriend's authentic charm." Sarah felt a twinge of irritation. "Glad to have contributed to your financial success. I have 3 other important events this month," he continued without noting her sarcastic tone. "Similar evenings with potential partners. I'm offering you $20,000 to accompany me to these 3 events. Same conditions, same expectations." Sarah stared at him, stunned by the amount. "Why me? You could hire any woman more used to this kind of event." James took a sip of his espresso before responding. "Because you're different. You're not impressed by this world. You don't seek to be part of it. And paradoxically, that makes you valuable in these contexts. Men like Wilson are surrounded by flatterers and opportunists. Your authenticity is refreshing to them. So you want to use me as an accessory to charm your business contacts?" "I'm proposing a mutually beneficial exchange," he corrected. "You get financial compensation that I presume remains useful. I get a presence that facilitates my negotiations." Sarah put down the pot she was holding and sat across from him, arms crossed. "I have conditions." James raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised by this response that was neither a categorical refusal nor an enthusiastic acceptance. "I'm listening. Precise and limited hours. I can't be away for long. My grandmother needs me. No expectations beyond what is explicitly agreed upon. And I want a written contract." An unexpected smile appeared on James's usually impassive face. "A contract? You negotiate like a professional." "I study business," she reminded him. "And I learned early that words fly, but writings remain." "Very well," he said, pulling out a card from his wallet. "My assistant will contact you this afternoon with a contract. First evening next Friday. Vernissage of an exhibition in Chelsea. My car will pick you up at 6. He rose, leaving a disproportionate tip relative to the price of the espresso. "By the way," he added, stopping at the door, "how is your grandmother?" This question, asked with unexpected sincerity, caught Sarah off guard. "Better," she replied softly. "The new medications seem to be helping." James nodded and left, leaving behind a scent of expensive cologne and a perplexed Sarah, wondering what complex story she had just committed to. What she didn't know yet was that James's assistant, Frances Taylor, who had worked for him for 15 years and harbored never-confessed feelings, had observed the entire scene from the car parked across the street, her heart tightening with each smile her boss directed at this stranger. The vernissage of the exhibition in Chelsea was the first of the 3 agreed-upon events. In a contemporary art gallery with immaculate white walls, Sarah once again played her role as attentive companion, politely listening to conversations about artists she had never heard of and techniques she knew nothing about. James, true to his reputation as a relentless businessman, navigated from one group to another with calculated ease, introducing Sarah as his partner without further explanation. She noticed, however, that he remained constantly attentive to her, discreetly checking if she was comfortable, briefly explaining who the important people in the room were. It was in the middle of the evening that Sarah stopped in front of a particular painting, a work with dark colors representing a child looking out the window of an austere building that resembled an orphanage. Something in this painted child's gaze, a mix of resignation and stubborn hope, touched her deeply. James joined her, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "You like Mercer?" he asked, handing her a flute. "I don't know the artist," she admitted, "but this work, there's something in this child's eyes." James studied the painting in silence, then said softly, "He spent his childhood in an orphanage near Boston. All his work revolves around this experience, the isolation, the waiting, that feeling of always being on the margins of the normal world." The tone with which he pronounced these words struck Sarah. It wasn't that of an art enthusiast reciting a biographical note, but something more personal, almost intimate. "You seem to know his work well," she observed. James remained silent for a moment, then replied in a voice slightly different from his usual tone. "I bought my first Mercer painting 10 years ago, well before he became recognized. It hangs in my office." "Why that one specifically?" asked Sarah, curious about this rare openness. James contemplated the painting as if looking for something in it. "I suppose some works speak to you because they reflect a part of you that you recognize," he finally said, "even if you'd rather not see it." Sarah observed him carefully. Perceiving for the first time a crack in the armor of this man she had categorized as cold and calculating. She was about to ask a more personal question when a female voice interrupted them. "James, I was just looking to introduce you to the new director of the foundation." Frances Taylor, James's assistant, stood there, elegant in a simple black dress. Her professional smile didn't quite manage to mask the meticulous assessment she was making of Sarah. "Frances, let me introduce you to Sarah Johnson," said James. "Sarah, this is Frances, my assistant for, how many years now?" 15 years, Frances replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've been through a lot together, haven't we, James?" "Indeed," he agreed distractedly. "Where's that director you mentioned?" While James was being led to another group, Frances remained for a moment at Sarah's side, examining the painting in front of them. "Interesting. This fascination with orphanages, isn't it?" she said in a soft voice. "James hasn't told you." Sarah looked at her with curiosity. "Told me what?" "About his childhood, of course. 10 years in an orphanage in Boston, until he ran away at 16. He never talks about it except with very close people." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. "I'm not very close to Mr. Miller," Sarah specified. "Our relationship is strictly professional." Frances gave a small, crystalline laugh. "Of course, like all the others before you. James has always had this inclination for complicated stories, but they invariably end the same way, when they're no longer useful to his professional objectives." With these words heavy with implications, Frances walked away, leaving Sarah troubled and thoughtful in front of the painting of the solitary child. Later that night, in the car taking her back to Brooklyn, Sarah couldn't help but think about Frances's words and James's reaction to that painting. This man she had initially perceived as a symbol of power and calculating coldness was beginning to reveal complexities she hadn't anticipated. "We've arrived, miss," announced the driver, stopping in front of her modest building. The transition between the luxurious world of the vernissage and the reality of her daily life was always brutal. The flickering lights of the building entrance, the mailbox overflowing with bills, the smell of spicy cooking coming from the neighbor's apartment, all this seemed both infinitely familiar and strangely distant after those hours spent in another universe. Climbing the 5 floors without an elevator, Sarah thought of her grandmother's words, who often repeated that people are never exactly what they appear to be at first glance. And James Miller, with his impeccable suits and his financial empire, seemed to hide behind his mask of assurance a story much more complex than she had imagined. A month had passed since the beginning of their arrangement. Sarah had accompanied James to 3 additional events, exceeding the initial framework of their contract. Each time he proposed an extension with a generous financial compensation that she accepted, mainly to cover the costly treatments for her grandmother. But something had changed in their dynamic. The formal conversations of the beginning had gradually given way to more personal exchanges. James was genuinely interested in her studies, her ambitions, her vision of the world. Sarah, for her part, was discovering behind the dreaded businessman a complex individual, marked by a difficult childhood that he sometimes mentioned in half words, never directly. Even more troubling was her own reaction to these developments. She now anticipated these evenings with an anticipation she refused to name, finding herself smiling when thinking back to some of their conversations. She kept telling herself that it was all just professional, a mutually beneficial transaction, nothing more. That morning, James had come to the cafe as had become his habit, settling at his usual table with his newspaper and espresso. Sarah had noticed that he increasingly prolonged his visits, sometimes staying until she finished her shift. He claimed to have calls to make or documents to read, but his gaze followed her across the room, observing her interactions with customers, the way she naturally smiled at regulars, the genuine attention she gave to each one. "You've got an admirer," Amy whispered, as she passed by with a loaded tray. "It's strictly professional," Sarah automatically replied. "Of course, and that's why he comes here every morning even though he lives across town. Very professional." Sarah was about to retort when the cafe door opened, letting in Frances, James's assistant. She wore an impeccable grey suit and a determined expression that immediately raised the tension in the room. James looked up from his newspaper, visibly surprised. "Frances, what brings you here?" "You missed 2 important calls this morning," she replied coldly. "The board is still waiting for your decision regarding the restructuring of the Chicago subsidiary." "I was just about to get to it," he said, checking his watch. "In half an hour." Frances cast a pointed look towards Sarah, who was wiping a table nearby. "I see. Always these personal priorities." The atmosphere instantly grew heavier. James closed his newspaper with a sharp gesture. "Frances, could you excuse us a moment?" he asked Sarah. "I need to speak privately with my assistant." Sarah nodded and moved away toward the counter, but not far enough to avoid hearing the conversation that followed, conducted in low but intense voices. "What's gotten into you?" James asked, with a rare irritation in his voice. "What's gotten into me?" Frances retorted. "You disappear every morning to come here. You postpone important meetings. You change work habits established over 15 years. And all for what? To observe a waitress who is obviously only interested in your bank account." James straightened, his face suddenly closed. "You're crossing the line, Frances. My personal life doesn't concern you. Your personal life affects your work, and your work directly concerns me," she shot back. "Have you forgotten what happened with that journalist 3 years ago? Or that artist before her? Always the same pattern. You get enthusiastic, you let yourself be distracted, then when they start to have expectations, you disappear. But this time it's different. This girl isn't like the others. She's more intelligent, more authentic," James suggested with a dangerously calm voice. "More calculating," Frances corrected. "She plays her role perfectly, doesn't she? The simple, honest young woman who isn't interested in your money. Have you investigated her? Do you really know who she is?" Sarah felt her heart tighten. The insinuation was clear and hurtful. "That's enough," James cut her off, rising. "You're going too far. I trust my judgment. Your judgment has always been excellent in business, James. But with women, you always look for those who remind you of what you've lost, never those who see what you truly are." With these words, Frances left the cafe, leaving behind a heavy silence. James remained motionless for a moment, then headed toward the counter where Sarah pretended to be busy arranging cups. "I'm sorry about that," he said softly. "Don't apologize," Sarah replied, without looking at him. "She cares about you, and she makes valid points." "What do you mean?" "Our arrangement is based on money, James. You pay me to play a role. How can you be sure that's not exactly what I'm doing, playing the character you want to see?" James observed her for a long time, looking for something in her expression. "Is that the case?" he finally asked. Sarah put down the cup she was holding and looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't know anymore," she admitted with an honesty that surprised even herself. "At the beginning it was clear. Now, the boundaries are blurring, and that scares me." Why? Because we don't come from the same world, James. Because I don't want to be a passing distraction in your well-ordered life. And above all, because I don't want to find myself depending on someone who might disappear as soon as I'm no longer useful. The word useful resonated between them, a painful reminder of their first conversation on the terrace of the plaza. James seemed about to say something, then held back. He took out his wallet and placed several bills on the counter. "For the espresso," he said simply. "I have to go to the office. We have this gala tonight. My car will pick you up as usual." "James, I'm not sure that—" "Please," he interrupted. "Come tonight. Afterward, if you want to end our arrangement, I'll understand." With these words, he left the cafe, leaving Sarah troubled and confused by the contradictory emotions assailing her. For the first time, she seriously considered ending this ambiguous relationship that had begun as a simple transaction and had become something she didn't have the courage to name. Behind her, Amy softly whistled. "Strictly professional, huh?" Sarah didn't answer, too absorbed by the whirlwind of her thoughts and the difficult decision she had to make before tonight. The Metropolitan Opera House was resplendent with 1,000 lights that evening, hosting the annual opera gala. The cultural and financial elite of the capital crowded in a shimmer of evening wear and sparkling jewels. Sarah, dressed in a burgundy gown with a discreet neckline, stood slightly apart while James conversed with a group of potential investors for his new project, the rehabilitation of former industrial sites into innovative cultural spaces. Despite the sumptuous setting and the ambient animation, a palpable tension existed between them since their conversation at the cafe that morning. They had barely exchanged a few words in the car, each lost in their thoughts, contemplating what increasingly resembled a breaking point. Sarah observed James from a distance, noting the subtle differences in his posture, his way of interacting. With others, he maintained that perfect facade of the accomplished businessman, but as soon as he thought no one was watching, a shadow passed over his face, a fleeting vulnerability that few people had probably ever glimpsed. Impressive, isn't it? Sarah turned to find Francis at her side, elegant in a black dress that highlighted her slender silhouette. The assistant contemplated the room with a studied detachment. "The building is magnificent," Sarah responded cautiously. "I wasn't talking about the architecture," Francis clarified with a smile devoid of warmth. "I was talking about him, about his ability to navigate these social waters as if he'd been born to them when he comes from nowhere. An orphan from Boston who built himself up from nothing." Sarah remained silent, uncertain of the direction this conversation was taking. "Do you know why I've worked for him for 15 years? Francis continued. "Because I saw the man behind the mask from the first day. I saw his vulnerability, his fear of abandonment, his desperate need to prove his worth, and I decided to protect him, against opportunists, manipulators, and sometimes against himself." She turned her piercing gaze towards Sarah. "He's beginning to get attached to you, really, not like with the others, and that terrifies me for him." Sarah felt a mixture of anger and confusion rise within her. "Why tell me all this?" "Because I want you to understand what's at stake," Francis replied, lowering her voice. "James isn't like other rich men you might meet. His empire is his protection against a world that rejected him from childhood. If he starts to believe he can trust, that he can open up and is once again disappointed, I'm not sure he'd recover." "You presume a lot about my intentions," said Sarah, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "I presume that you're human," Francis replied, "and that sooner or later you'll realize your place isn't in this world, that the differences are too great, that you can never truly understand what shapes him, and that day you'll leave, like the others." Before Sarah could respond, James appeared at their side, his expression unreadable. "Francis, the senator would like to discuss the docks project. Could you present the preliminary file to him?" Francis nodded, cast a last meaningful look at Sarah, then walked away with feline grace. "What were you talking about?" James asked once she was out of earshot. "About you," Sarah honestly replied. "Your past. Your present." James remained silent for a moment, his gaze scanning the elegant crowd surrounding them. "And what did she say exactly?" "That you come from an orphanage in Boston, that you built yourself up from nothing, that you're—" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to phrase the rest. "That I what?" he gently pressed, that you're beginning to get attached to me, and that terrifies her because I'll inevitably end up disappointing you and leaving." A muscle twitched in James's jaw. He gently took Sarah's arm and led her to an adjacent balcony, away from indiscreet ears. The New York night stretched before them, constellated with lights that seemed to reflect the stars above their heads. "Frances is protective," he finally said. "She's witnessed certain mistakes I've made in the past." "Is it true?" asked Sarah. "What she said about your childhood?" James looked away, fixing on the urban horizon, as if searching for something there. "Yes. I spent 10 years in an orphanage in Boston. My parents died in an accident when I was 6. I had no family to take me in. At 16, I'd had enough and left. I worked, studied when I could, seized every opportunity, and I swore I'd become someone no one could ignore or abandon." His voice was calm, almost detached, but Sarah could perceive the old pain that underpinned each word. "And is it also true for the rest?" she dared to ask. "Are you getting attached to me?" James turned to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his gaze was completely devoid of that calculated assurance that characterized him. He seemed almost vulnerable. "I don't know what's true anymore, Sarah. I know I come here every morning just to see you for a few minutes. I know I anticipate these evenings not for the business contacts, but for the moments when we're alone, when you talk to me like a real person, not like the man my money created." He ran a hand through his hair, an unusual gesture that betrayed his disturbance. "But I also know that all this started as a transaction, that you accepted for the money, not for me, and that I can't blame you for leaving when, if, you decide this arrangement has lasted long enough." Sarah felt her heart tighten at this unexpected honesty. She wanted to respond, but before she could find the right words, James's phone rang. He checked the screen, and his face changed instantly, all vulnerability erased. "I need to take this call," he said, regaining his professional tone. "Excuse me a moment." He moved a few steps away, leaving Sarah alone with her tumultuous thoughts. She observed this man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, this man whose life was divided into hermetic compartments, the business world on one side, the rare moments of authenticity on the other. James returned after a few minutes, his face grave. "I have to leave immediately," he announced. "Anthony, my oldest associate, has just been admitted to the emergency room. Heart problem." "Oh, James, I'm sorry," Sarah said sincerely. "My car will take you home," he added, checking his watch. "I have to go to Mount Sinai Hospital immediately." He was about to leave when Sarah stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Wait, I'm coming with you." James looked at her with surprise. "It's not necessary. Our arrangement doesn't cover hospital visits." "I'm not coming because of our arrangement," she replied softly. "I'm coming because no one should be alone at times like these." Something in James's gaze broke, a crack in the armor carefully maintained for decades. He simply nodded, unable to speak, and together they left the gala, leaving behind the sparkling lights and light music to face the brutal reality that awaited them. The antiseptic corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital seemed endless. The characteristic smell of disinfectant and the distant hum of machines created a suspended atmosphere, as if time itself flowed differently in this parallel universe of suffering and waiting. Sarah followed James, who advanced with quick steps, his usual confidence replaced by a visible tension in every muscle of his body. At the intensive care reception, a nurse stopped them. "I'm sorry, but only close family is allowed at this hour," she explained with the gentle firmness characteristic of her profession. "Anthony Davis has no family," James replied, with a note of urgency in his voice. "I am his closest contact." The nurse consulted her computer, then nodded. "Indeed, you are listed as the person to notify in case of emergency. You may enter, Mr. Miller, but your companion will have to wait here." Sarah placed a light hand on James's forearm. "Go, I'll wait here. Take your time." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and followed the nurse through the swinging doors. Sarah settled into the waiting room, suddenly very aware of her evening gown that contrasted sharply with the austere decor of the hospital. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Around her, other people waited, some in silence, others whispering, all united by the same anxious tension that medical uncertainty generates. Sarah thought back to the events of the evening, to James's confession on the balcony, to Frances's warnings, to her own confusion in the face of feelings she hadn't anticipated. Around 1 in the morning, James finally reappeared. He looked exhausted, his features drawn, his tie loosened. He sat heavily next to Sarah. "How is he?" she asked softly. "Stable for now. Moderate heart attack. They're going to keep him under observation for several days." Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing he needed to talk. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "Anthony is 72. He's the one who gave me my first chance when I was 22 and had nothing but ambition. He bet on me when no one else would have. And now to see him so vulnerable." His voice broke slightly on this last word. Sarah took his hand in hers, a simple gesture of comfort she would never have dared a few weeks earlier. "Does he have family?" she asked. James shook his head. "His wife died 10 years ago. No children. I'm the closest thing to family he has. And yet—" He paused, searching for words. "And yet," Sarah gently encouraged, "and yet, I've neglected our relationship these past few years, too busy with acquisitions, mergers, constant growth. When you work relentlessly to build something, you sometimes forget why you're building it, or for whom." There was in this confession a vulnerability that Sarah had never seen in him, even in their most intimate moments. This powerful man, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, suddenly seemed lost in the face of a situation beyond his power. "You should go home," he said suddenly. "It's late, and you must be tired." "I'm staying," she replied simply. "Sarah, this isn't necessary," she completed. "I know. I'm not here out of obligation, James." He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to decipher a particularly complex enigma. "Why then?" The question floated between them, loaded with implications. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "Because in these past months, something has changed. What began as a commercial arrangement has become something else. I don't know exactly what, and that scares me. But I know I don't want you to go through this night alone." James looked away, and Sarah thought she glimpsed an unusual moisture in his eyes that he quickly concealed. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said in a low voice. "Not after the way this all began." "It's not a question of deserving," she replied. "It's a question of humanity, of connection." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but loaded with unspoken words and unexplored possibilities. Sarah sensed that something important was happening, a fundamental change in their relationship that had begun so improbably in that little Brooklyn cafe. A doctor appeared, interrupting this moment. "Mr. Miller? Mr. Davis has woken up and is asking to see you." James rose immediately, then turned to Sarah, hesitating. "Go," she said with an encouraging smile. "I'll still be here when you get back." When he disappeared again behind the swinging doors, Sarah found herself alone with the troubling realization that she was developing deep feelings for a man who lived in a radically different world from hers. A man whose life was built on control and emotional distance, two things she was perhaps irremediably disrupting. The night stretched on, and with it, the unanswered questions that swirled in her mind. Dawn was timidly peeking through the waiting room windows when James returned, his face marked by a sleepless night, but slightly calmer. Sarah, who had dozed off on the uncomfortable plastic chair, straightened up as she saw him approach. "How is he?" she asked, her voice still husky from sleep. "Better. The doctors are optimistic. They're talking about an intervention in a few days, but nothing urgent." He sat beside her, observing her rumpled evening gown and disheveled hair with an indecipherable expression. "You stayed all night," he noted. It wasn't a question, but Sarah perceived a nuance of persistent surprise in it, as if he still couldn't believe in her presence. "I told you I would," she replied simply. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have gone through something important together. "I should take you home," James finally said. "Your grandmother must be worried." Sarah checked her phone. "I sent her a message last night, she understands." James nodded, then stood up with new determination. "Come on, I'll take you home. Then I need to stop by the office and handle some urgencies." "Now?" Sarah was surprised. "After a sleepless night." "The markets don't wait," he replied with a tired smile. "And I have an important acquisition in progress. The Harrington Group is waiting for my final decision this morning on a buyout offer. Sarah observed him carefully, noting the circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. How much does it represent? This acquisition. About $15 million in potential profit over the next 2 years if everything goes as planned. And Anthony? She asked softly. What about Anthony? Who's going to stay with him today? Who's going to make sure he doesn't feel alone in that hospital room? James froze, as if this question hadn't crossed his mind. I'll come back to see him this evening, after the meetings. Sarah stood up as well, facing him with a quiet assurance. James, you told me yesterday that Anthony was the closest thing to family you have, and that you regretted neglecting your relationship these past years. Are $15 million worth more than being there for him now, when he really needs you? A visible conflict played out on James's face, the businessman accustomed to prioritizing financial opportunities against something deeper, more human, that seemed to be slowly emerging. It's not that simple, he said. Jobs depend on this acquisition. Commitments have been made. Life is never simple, Sarah replied. That's precisely what makes it precious. We are defined by our choices, especially the difficult ones. James stared at her for a long time, as if he was truly seeing her for the first time. How do you do that? He finally asked. Do what? See so clearly what's important, without getting distracted by numbers, opportunities, others' expectations. Sarah smiled slightly. Maybe it's because I've never had the luxury of getting lost in abstraction. When every dollar counts, when every hour of work is necessary to pay the rent or medicines, you learn to distinguish the essential from the superfluous. She paused, then added, My grandmother often says that true wealth is measured by what you're willing to sacrifice for those you love, not by what you accumulate for yourself. James remained silent for a long time, then pulled out his phone. Sarah watched him dial a number, intrigued. Francis? It's me. I need you to reschedule all of today's meetings. Yes, all of them. Contact Harrington and tell him our offer still stands, but they'll have to wait until tomorrow for final confirmation. I won't be reachable before this evening. He hung up under Sarah's astonished gaze. You just postponed a $15 million acquisition? She asked, incredulous. It would seem so, he replied with a weary smile. Anthony was there for me when I needed him. He deserves the same in return. They left the hospital together and got into the car that was waiting for them. The driver, visibly accustomed to long waits, didn't bat an eye at their rumpled and tired appearance. To Brooklyn, please, James indicated. No, Sarah corrected. To your place first. You need to change, take a shower, maybe even sleep an hour or two before going back to the hospital. You'll be no help to Anthony if you collapse from exhaustion. James raised his eyebrows, visibly unaccustomed to being given orders. Home first, John, he nevertheless conceded to his driver. The car started smoothly, moving away from the hospital toward the upscale neighborhoods of Manhattan. Sarah contemplated through the tinted window the city that was awakening, the first subway trains pouring out their flood of workers, the cafes opening their doors, this daily choreography of a metropolis in motion. Beside her, James observed her silently, troubled by this woman who had just influenced a major professional decision with a few simple words about what really mattered. A woman who had spent the night on an uncomfortable chair, just so he wouldn't be alone without expecting compensation. A woman who, little by little, was shaking the carefully constructed foundations of his compartmentalized life. What he didn't know yet was that this choice, prioritizing Anthony over a lucrative acquisition, would mark the beginning of a transformation much deeper than he could imagine. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the hospital. Anthony was slowly recovering, benefiting from daily visits from James, who had reorganized his schedule with a determination that had stunned his team. The acquisition of the Harrington Group had finally been concluded, with a day's delay but under more favorable conditions, as if this slight detachment had paradoxically strengthened his negotiating position. Sarah and James had developed a strange and sweet routine. He still came to the cafe in the morning, but never again spoke of money or their initial arrangement. They saw each other some evenings, no longer for social events, but for simple dinners in discreet bistros or walks along the Hudson River. Their relationship was evolving into something that neither dared to name, perhaps for fear of breaking its fragility. That day, James had proposed something different, coming to meet her grandmother. Sarah had hesitated, aware of crossing a new symbolic threshold, but had finally accepted, curious to see how these two such different universes might meet. The modest Brooklyn building seemed even smaller and more worn in Sarah's eyes as she guided James up the narrow staircase to the 5th floor. She felt an unexpected embarrassment, not about her modest situation, which she had always assumed with dignity, but about this striking contrast between their respective worlds. "It's here," she said, stopping in front of a door with peeling paint. James was carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers and a box of fine pastries, a choice that she had found both touching and slightly awkward in its obvious attempt to not arrive empty-handed without appearing ostentatious. Martha Johnson welcomed them with the quiet dignity that characterized her. At 72, she carried the weight of her illness with stoic grace, her frail body contrasting with the vivacity of her gaze. The expensive treatments had slowed the progression of the cancer, offering her these precious moments of lucidity that Sarah cherished. "So you're the famous James," said Martha after the introductions, observing him with undisguised curiosity. "I am," he confirmed, with a slightly nervous smile that Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah has told me a lot about you." "And strangely, she said very little about you," Martha replied with a frankness that made her granddaughter blush. "Until recently, at least." The apartment was small, but impeccably kept. Photos of Sarah as a child adorned the walls, alongside yellowed images of Virginia, where Martha had spent her youth. A collection of worn books filled a rickety shelf, mainly classics of American literature, signs of a love of reading that the modesty of means had never diminished. "Please sit down," Martha invited, gesturing towards the small kitchen table. "Sarah has prepared tea." James settled in, visibly uncomfortable on the mismatched chair. Sarah busied herself serving tea in old cups that didn't form a complete set, but each had their own history. "Sarah told me you work in finance," Martha began once they were all seated. "You buy struggling companies to resell them at a higher price, is that right?" James cast a glance at Sarah, who imperceptibly shrugged as if to say, "She gets straight to the point." "That's one way to look at it," he admitted, "but I prefer to think that we transform struggling structures into viable entities that preserve jobs." Martha made a sound, clearly skeptical. "And what does that bring you, personally?" "Grandmother," Sarah intervened, embarrassed by this direct question. "Let her, Sarah," James said softly. "It's a legitimate question." He turned to Martha, his professional mask momentarily abandoned. "For a long time it was mainly validation, proof that I was worth something in a world that measures value in numbers. But recently, I've started to ask myself the same question." This response seemed to surprise Martha, whose gaze softened slightly. The conversation drifted toward more neutral topics, Virginia that Martha and James both knew, albeit from very different perspectives, Sarah's studies that James now actively encouraged, Anthony's progress at the hospital. While Sarah excused herself to prepare more tea, Martha took the opportunity to address James directly. "She's all I have, you know," she said in a low voice. "When her parents left her on my doorstep with just a note of explanation, she was only 7. I saw in her eyes that wound left by abandonment, the same I sometimes see in yours, despite your fine suits and your assurance." James remained silent, surprised by this perceptive observation. "I don't know what you're looking for exactly with my granddaughter," Martha continued, "but I recognize someone who has built walls to protect themselves. The problem with walls, Mr. Miller, is that they prevent as much from entering as from leaving." "I have no intention of hurting her," James finally said. "I'm not even sure I understand what's happening between us." "Love isn't a business transaction," Martha observed. "You can't plan it, negotiate it, or control it. That's precisely what makes it terrifying. And priceless." Sarah returned at that moment, interrupting this private exchange but sensing that something important had happened in her absence. The rest of the visit proceeded in a more relaxed atmosphere. James, against all expectations, seemed to adapt to this simple environment. He listened with real attention to the stories Martha told about Sarah's youth, laughing at anecdotes and asking questions that revealed a genuine interest. When it came time to leave, Martha held James back for a moment at the door while Sarah retrieved her coat. "She's not for sale, you know," she said simply, her tired but piercing eyes fixed on him. "Not for money, not for promises, not even for feelings. Sarah deserves someone who sees her intrinsic value. James held her gaze with unusual sincerity. I'm beginning to understand that, Mrs. Johnson. As they descended the stairs, Sarah noticed that James seemed lost in his thoughts. She gave you a talking to, didn't she? She asked, both amused and concerned. Let's say rather that she gave me food for thought, he replied with a thoughtful smile. Your grandmother is a remarkable woman. She's adopted you, I think, Sarah observed. She usually doesn't look people in the eye when she doesn't trust them. With you, she didn't look away even once. This observation seemed to touch James more than he wanted to show. They walked in silence to the waiting car, each aware that a new phase of their relationship had just opened, a phase where separate worlds were slowly beginning to converge. James's office occupied the entire top floor of a modern building near Wall Street. Vast space with minimalist lines dominated by a bay window, offering a panoramic view of New York, it perfectly reflected its occupant, elegant, impressive, but strangely impersonal. With the exception of a Mercer painting hung on the wall facing the desk, nothing betrayed the personality of the man who spent most of his days there. Sarah was there for the first time, having accepted James's invitation to lunch in what constituted his territory. Francis had greeted her with an icy politeness, leading her through the maze of corridors where employees in suits worked in a studious silence, interrupted only by the discreet clicking of keyboards and the muffled murmur of telephone conversations. He's finishing a conference call, Francis informed her, leaving her in the office. He asks you to wait here. Once alone, Sarah scanned the room looking for clues about this man she knew intimately in some ways, and not at all in others. No personal photos, no sentimental objects, just books on finance, some commercial excellence awards under glass, and that single painting, the child at the orphanage window whose gaze seemed to follow visitors wherever they were in the room. On the perfectly ordered desk, an open folder caught her attention. Upon approaching, she recognized her own name in the header. Intrigued and slightly worried, she glanced at the contents and froze. It was a private investigation report on her, detailed, meticulous, going back to her childhood. Her interrupted studies, the 3 jobs she juggled, her grandmother's health status, her habits, her few friends, even her bank account. Everything was there, dissected, analyzed, like a company being evaluated before acquisition. The date of the report, 2 days after their first meeting at the cafe, caused a sudden nausea. All this time, he had known. Every detail of her precarious life, her financial vulnerability, her responsibilities, her interrupted dreams. It wasn't chance that had led him to offer her exactly the amount she needed for her grandmother's treatments. It was a cold calculation, an evaluation of what it would take to buy her. Sarah, James's voice made her start. He stood in the doorway, his expression quickly shifting from surprise to understanding as he saw what she was looking at. I can explain, he began. Really, she replied, her voice trembling with anger and disappointment. You can explain why you investigated my life before even knowing me, why you calculated exactly how much I would need for my grandmother's care. It's my usual way of proceeding, he said, slowly advancing into the room. I wanted to ensure you were suitable. Suitable, she repeated with disbelief. Like a product you inspect before purchase. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his discomfort. It was a mistake, he admitted. But at the time, our arrangement was purely professional. I had to make sure that you didn't represent a risk. A risk, repeated Sarah, anger rising within her. Is that how you see people? As variables to evaluate, risks to quantify? She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I was so stupid. I really started to believe you were changing, that you were seeing beyond transactions and calculations, that what was developing between us was real. James moved closer, stopping when she instinctively backed away. It is real, Sarah. This report, it was before really knowing you. Before you changed my vision of so many things. How can I believe you? She asked softly. How can I know it's not just another strategy, another calculation to get what you want? James seemed genuinely at a loss, as if words failed him for the first time in his career as a negotiator. Look around you, he finally said, gesturing to his office. Everything here is control, planning, risk analysis. That's how I survived. It's the only way I know. He approached the Mercer painting, contemplating it for a moment before continuing. When I was at the orphanage, I learned very early that vulnerability was dangerous, that trusting meant exposing yourself to disappointment. So I built systems, methods to control everything, foresee everything. Every relationship, every interaction, every decision, everything was calculated to minimize risks and maximize gains. He turned to her, his face devoid of the mask of assurance he usually wore. And then you arrived, you who had nothing to lose and yet refused to compromise, who lived with an authenticity I didn't understand, who saw beyond facades and fortunes to touch what really matters. Sarah remained silent, touched despite herself by this confession, but still hurt by the discovery of the dossier. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," James continued, "just to understand that the man who commissioned this investigation is not quite the same today. That something has changed, even if I don't yet know exactly what or how to deal with it." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words and contradictory emotions. Sarah contemplated this man who had upended her life, first with an indecent financial proposal, then with an unexpected connection that defied all logic. "I need to go," she finally said. "I need to think." "Sarah." "No, James. I can't. Not now. I need to take stock." She headed for the door, then stopped and turned around. "You know what's ironic? I accepted your initial proposal for the money, that's true. But over time, I began to see the man behind the empire, to appreciate his qualities, his complexity, to imagine possibilities. And now I discover it was all calculated from the beginning." "Not everything," he replied softly. "Not what I feel now." She looked at him for a long time, as if searching for something in his eyes. "How can I know what's true and what's strategy?" With this question that remained unanswered, she left the office, leaving behind a James more distraught than he had been in decades. A week passed without contact between them. Sarah had resumed her usual routine, serving coffee, caring for her grandmother, studying during her rare free moments. But everything seemed different, as if the world's colors had slightly dulled. She jumped every time the cafe doorbell chimed, both hoping and dreading to see James appear. He didn't come. Instead, it was Frances who showed up on a rainy morning, as elegant as ever under her black umbrella. The cafe was almost empty, the pouring rain discouraging regular customers. "He won't come," Frances announced without preamble, settling at the counter. "He thinks you need space." Sarah continued drying cups, trying to mask her reaction to this news. "Is that what you advised him?" she finally asked. Frances observed her with an indecipherable expression. "Contrary to what you think, I'm not your enemy, Sarah." "Really? After all your warnings about my intentions, about the fact that I would just be a passing distraction?" "I've spent 15 years protecting James," Frances explained. "Watching over him as he doesn't know how to watch over himself. I've seen women parade by who were attracted by his fortune, his power, or sometimes rarely, by the man behind the facade. All ended up leaving when they realized he didn't know how to give what they were looking for." She paused, observing the rain beating against the cafe windows. "But with you, it's different. For the first time I've seen him change, question his priorities, put people before profits. Make decisions based not on risk analyses, but on feelings." Sarah didn't know how to respond to this unexpected observation. "The dossier," she began. "The dossier was a mistake," Frances cut her off. "A control habit he deeply regrets. Do you know what he's done these past few days?" Sarah shook her head. "He finalized a fund to fully finance your studies, not as a loan or a gift, but as a formal investment in your professional future, with a contract that clearly stipulates you have no obligation to him or his company. He also created a foundation to help students in your situation, those who must abandon their studies for financial or family reasons." Frances took an envelope from her bag and placed it on the counter. "These are the documents. He didn't want to send them himself, fearing you would see it as an attempt to buy you back." Sarah stared at the envelope without touching it. "Why are you telling me all this? Why are you here when you clearly made me understand you considered me a threat?" Frances had a sad smile. "Because I realized that what I feared most wasn't that you would hurt him, but that you had the power to truly transform him. And maybe, that's exactly what he needs." She stood up, adjusting her elegant suit. "He'll be at the hospital this afternoon to visit Anthony, around 3. In case that information interests you." With these words, she left in the pouring rain, leaving Sarah alone with the envelope and swirling thoughts. It was Amy who finally pushed her to act. "If you don't go to that hospital today, I quit," she categorically declared. "I refuse to continue working with someone so stubborn and blind." "It's not that simple," Sarah protested. "He investigated me, Amy, before even knowing me." "So what? You think I haven't Googled all my exes before dating them?" Okay, he pushed the concept a bit far, but the intention was the same: to protect himself, to understand who he was dealing with. She took Sarah by the shoulders. "Listen to me. This man has built his entire life on control because he was abandoned as a child, and now he's ready to risk all that control, all his habits, for you. If that's not love, I don't know what is." At 3 o'clock sharp, Sarah stood outside Anthony's room at Mount Sinai Hospital. Through the glass, she could see James seated by the bed, listening attentively to the old man who was speaking with animation despite his obvious weakness. There was a tenderness in this scene that contrasted sharply with the public image of the ruthless businessman. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Then Anthony spotted her, and his face lit up. He gestured toward James, who turned around, surprise and then a more complex emotion crossing his face. When he came out to join her in the corridor, Sarah was struck by his appearance. He seemed to have lost weight. Circles marked his eyes, and even his impeccable suit couldn't mask an obvious fatigue. "Sarah," he said simply, her name pronounced like a prayer. "I had to see you," she began. "I've thought a lot this week. About us, about what all this means, about the possibility that there can even be an us despite our worlds being so different." James listened to her intensely, without interrupting. "I was angry about the dossier," she continued. "I still am a bit, but I realized something important. We both started this relationship on transactional basis. You with your investigation and financial proposal, me by accepting for the money." She paused, searching for words. "But what truly matters isn't how things begin. It's how they evolve. And what has developed between us, Mac, is more real than anything I've known." James's face softened, hope gradually replacing worry in his gaze. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of being wrong, afraid of not being up to your world, afraid that our differences will end up separating us. But I'm even more afraid of missing out on something authentic, out of simple fear of the unknown." "Sarah," he said softly, taking her hands in his, "I'm not good at this. Words, feelings, vulnerability, everything that can't be quantified or controlled. But I know one thing with certainty. These past months with you have been the truest of my entire adult life." He squeezed her hands a little tighter. "You made me realize that I've spent decades building an empire to prove my worth, without ever asking myself what truly had value for me. You saw the frightened child behind the powerful man, and instead of taking advantage of this weakness, you showed me it could be a strength." Sarah felt tears come to her eyes at this rare confession. "I'm not asking you to change for me," she said. "I don't want you to abandon who you are." "I know," he replied with a smile. "That's precisely why I want to change. Not because you demand it, but because you make me want to be better, more authentic, more present for what truly matters." Anthony was watching them through the glass, a benevolent smile on his tired face. In this impersonal hospital corridor, something profound and transformative was happening, the authentic meeting of two people who, despite their differences, had found in each other an echo to their own quest for belonging and meaning. "So what do we do now?" asked Sarah. James smiled, a smile different from any she had seen before, without calculation, without reserve, simply human. "Now," he said, "we write our own story, without contract, without arrangement, without pre-established roles, just you and me discovering together what it means to build something authentic from imperfect foundations." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you're ready to take that risk with me." Sarah didn't respond with words. She simply leaned toward him and kissed him, their first real kiss without pretext or role to play. A kiss that marked not the end of an arrangement, but the beginning of something infinitely more precious and more true. The little Brooklyn cafe hadn't changed much in 2 years. Same worn tables, same patinated wooden counter, same bell on the door that chimed softly with each entry. But everything else had evolved. Sarah no longer worked there as a waitress. She had just obtained her business degree with honors and now directed the New Horizons Foundation, created by James, an organization that helped young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue higher education while supporting their families. The cafe itself had become the pilot project of a neighborhood business revitalization program. Amy, now the manager, welcomed interns in professional reinsertion, offering them valuable training and experience. James and Sarah had found a delicate balance between their two worlds. They shared their time between the renovated Brooklyn apartment to stay close to Martha, whose health had miraculously stabilized, and a more spacious loft in Soho. James had considerably reduced his working hours, delegating more to a carefully constituted team, of which Francis remained a central pillar, having developed a mutual respect with Sarah that surprised everyone, starting with themselves. That morning they were seated at the corner table, the very one where it had all begun 2 years earlier. James was reading the newspaper while Sarah reviewed a partnership proposal for the foundation. They weren't speaking, simply present for each other in a silent comfort that said much about the path traveled. The bell chimed and Anthony entered, leaning slightly on a cane but looking in much better shape than after his hospitalization. Since his official retirement, he had become actively involved as a mentor to young entrepreneurs supported by the foundation. "Ah, my two favorite people," he exclaimed, approaching. "Ready for the big announcement?" James folded his newspaper and smiled. "Always so impatient, Anthony." "At my age, one no longer has the luxury of waiting, my boy," he replied with humor. Martha arrived shortly after, accompanied by Amy. Sarah's grandmother had flourished in these past years. The treatment had stabilized her cancer, and though still present, it no longer defined her life. She had discovered a passion for teaching English to immigrants in the neighborhood, using her patience and wisdom to create bridges between cultures. "Well," Anthony pressed once everyone was settled, "what is this important news?" Sarah and James exchanged a complicit look before Sarah spoke. "We have two announcements, actually," she began. "The first concerns the foundation. We've just received official accreditation for our alternating training program. From September, we'll be able to offer state-recognized diplomas." Exclamations of joy greeted this news. The foundation, born from a simple idea, had become a respected institution that was concretely changing lives. "And the second?" asked Martha, who seemed to already know. James took Sarah's hand in his before answering. "We're getting married," he announced simply. "Right here, in this cafe. Without frills, without social pretense, just the people who truly matter to us." Anthony burst into joyful laughter, while Amy applauded enthusiastically. Martha observed the couple with an expression of deep contentment, as if she had always known things would end this way. "No grand ceremony at the plaza," Anthony teased. "I thought the great James Miller never did things halfway." "I've learned something important these past years," James replied, looking tenderly at Sarah. "True value isn't measured by the scale of events or numbers in a bank account. It's measured by the authenticity of shared moments and created connections." Sarah squeezed his hand, moved by these words that perfectly summarized their journey. "Besides," she added with a mischievous smile, "this is where it all began, with an indecent proposal and spilled coffee." They all laughed, united by this improbable story that had transformed each of them in its own way. James was no longer the cold, calculating man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. Sarah was no longer the young woman struggling alone against adversity. Together, they had created something that surpassed their individual identities, a relationship that drew its strength precisely from their differences and from the path traveled to transcend them. Later, as the sun began to set and their friends had departed, James and Sarah remained alone at their table. He pulled out a small box from his pocket, not one of those boxes from major jewelry houses, but a simple, handcrafted wooden case. "I wanted to give you this in private," he said softly, "not in front of the others." Sarah opened the box to discover not a flashy ring as she might have expected, but a simple white gold band adorned with a small rough stone. "It's an uncut diamond," James explained. "Most people prefer perfectly cut diamonds, brilliant, formatted according to precise standards. But I've always found something more authentic, more powerful in their raw form. Like you, who taught me that true beauty resides in authenticity, not artificial perfection." Sarah felt tears come to her eyes at this deeply symbolic gesture. "It's perfect," she murmured, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Exactly like us. imperfect separately but perfectly complementary together. James gently caressed her cheek, his gaze reflecting that vulnerability he no longer dared hide with her. Who would have thought that by entering this cafe 2 years ago with a perfectly calculated plan, I would find the one thing I had never been able to plan for or buy, someone who would see beyond the empire to love the man it was hiding. Sarah smiled, placing her hand on his. And who would have thought that by accepting an indecent proposal out of necessity, I would discover that sometimes the most improbable paths lead to the most precious destinations. The cafe was quiet now, bathed in the soft evening light filtering through the windows. In this simple place where it had all begun, two people from radically different worlds had found what neither money nor wisdom could guarantee, an authentic love, built not despite their differences, but because of them. For if the initial arrangement had a price, what they had created together was truly priceless.